The old man never knew what was happening under his own roof. My son-in-law smiled as he lifted his wine glass, and 22 people laughed politely because they believed they had just heard a harmless joke during my wife and my 45th wedding anniversary dinner. They couldn't see what I saw. They couldn't recognize the tiny smirk that had appeared at the left corner of Derek Holt's mouth halfway through his toast. I had been watching that exact smirk for 14 months. I knew what it meant long before anyone else in that private dining room did. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't argue. I didn't even look angry. Instead, I reached into my jacket, pulled out my phone, and pressed play on an audio recording I had carried in my pocket for 3 days. 90 seconds later, the smile had disappeared from Derek's face forever. Before I tell you how a family celebration turned into the longest 90 seconds of my son-in-law's life, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're listening from today. Stories like this remind us that the strongest families are built on trust, and the most dangerous betrayals usually begin with the people sitting closest to us. My name is Raymond Osei. I am 68 years old, and until that night everyone believed I had spent 11 years treating Derek Holt like the son I never had. That part was true. What nobody knew was that I had also spent the previous 14 months quietly documenting every step he took toward destroying my family. The recording echoing across the dining room wasn't an accident. It wasn't a lucky discovery. It was the final piece of evidence in an investigation I had been conducting inside my own home, while the man standing with the wine glass believed I was too old to notice what he was doing. Derek looked around the room, hoping someone would rescue him from the silence that followed his own voice coming out of my phone. Nobody moved. My daughter Simone stared at him without blinking. My wife Beverly rested one hand on the table, perfectly calm, as though she had already accepted that the evening could never return to what it had been only 2 minutes earlier. Around us sat old friends, former business partners, neighbors who had known our family for decades, every one of them suddenly realizing they weren't attending an anniversary dinner anymore. They were watching a man discover that the person he had underestimated had been listening all along. Derek slowly lowered his wine glass onto the table, but his hand was shaking enough for everyone to hear the crystal touch the wood. He opened his mouth once, closed it again, then looked directly at me. It was the first time in 14 months I had seen genuine uncertainty in his eyes. Until that moment, he had believed he controlled the pace of every conversation, every visit, every carefully chosen question about my retirement, my finances, and the house my wife and I had spent more than 30 years building together. He believed he understood me completely. He had no idea that every move he made had quietly become another page in a file my attorney was already waiting to use if the day ever came. I leaned forward just enough for everyone at the table to hear me without raising my voice. The old man knew exactly what was happening under his roof, I said. I simply wanted to know how far you were willing to go before you believed you'd already won. No one spoke. Not Derek, not Simone, not even Beverly. The silence filling that room wasn't caused by the recording. It was caused by the realization that someone had spent more than a year pretending not to notice betrayal while patiently allowing the truth to reveal itself. That anniversary dinner wasn't the beginning of our story. It was only the night the evidence finally became impossible to deny. To understand why I let Derek finish his toast before exposing him in front of everyone he cared about, you have to go back 14 months to the first small change almost nobody else noticed. If you had asked me 14 months before that anniversary dinner whether I trusted Derek Holt, I would have answered without hesitation. Absolutely. He had been married to my daughter Simone for 11 years, and during the first 8 of them, I never once questioned his character. He arrived early whenever the family gathered, carried groceries inside without being asked, remembered birthdays most people forgot, and had the rare ability to make every conversation feel as though the other person was the most important individual in the room. I admired that quality because I believed it came from kindness. It never occurred to me that it could also be a professional skill. Derek worked in residential real estate, where earning trust was often the first step toward closing a deal. I simply never imagined he might someday use that same talent inside his own family. Everything changed in the summer after I sold Osei Engineering and Technical Services. 32 years of structural engineering had finally come to an end, and the acquisition became public after the purchasing firm issued its press release. I didn't celebrate the sale because of the money. I celebrated it because it meant Beverly and I could finally enjoy the quiet life we had postponed for decades. We talked about traveling through the Carolinas in the fall, spending longer weekends with old friends, and finishing the garden Beverly had been redesigning for years. I believed retirement would make life simpler. Instead, it quietly attracted the one thing I had spent my entire career, learning to recognize pressure building inside a structure before anyone else noticed the cracks. Derek's visits slowly became more frequent. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Sunday dinners twice a month became 3. Then he started stopping by during the week, usually carrying coffee or dessert. "I was already in the neighborhood," he would say, with an easy smile. Beverly appreciated the attention, and so did I. Looking back now, I realize manipulation almost never begins with demands. It begins with generosity that asks for nothing in return until everyone stops questioning why it happens so often. Derek never mentioned money directly. Instead, he talked about neighborhoods, property values, market trends, families relocating into Buckhead. One evening, he stood beside the kitchen window looking toward our backyard and casually remarked, "Homes on Arbor Ridge are selling for numbers nobody would have believed 10 years ago." I smiled and agreed. Atlanta had changed dramatically. That conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. 3 days later, he mentioned the same thing again. The following week, he asked whether I had ever considered downsizing now that Beverly and I were retired. "You'd probably make a fortune selling this place," he said while stirring sugar into his coffee. The words sounded harmless enough that anyone overhearing them would have assumed he was making ordinary conversation. But I spent 32 years inspecting buildings. I learned long ago that structures rarely fail because of one large crack. They fail because dozens of tiny stresses quietly push in the same direction until something finally gives way. Derek wasn't asking about my future. He was measuring it. Every visit produced another small question wrapped inside polite curiosity. Had I updated my estate documents? Did I ever worry about maintaining such a large property? Would Simone eventually inherit the house? Each question by itself meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The most revealing part wasn't what Derek asked. It was what he never asked. He never asked how Beverly was adjusting to retirement. He never asked what projects I wanted to pursue now that engineering no longer consumed my schedule. He never asked whether we were happy. Every conversation somehow circled back to the house, the business sale, or the future of our assets. One evening after Derek and Simone drove home, Beverly smiled while loading the dishwasher. "He's been coming around a lot lately," she said. "It's nice having family close." I looked out the kitchen window toward the dark outline of the backyard, where I had built the deck with my own hands nearly 20 years earlier. "Yes," I answered quietly. "It is." I didn't tell her what had been bothering me for weeks, because I wasn't ready to accuse a man based on instinct alone. Instinct might begin an investigation, but evidence had to finish it. The next morning, before anyone else in my family woke up, I picked up my phone and called the one person I trusted to tell me whether the pattern I was seeing was real or whether I had simply become an old engineer who had spent too many years expecting hidden weaknesses behind every beautiful design. Patricia Asante answered before the second ring, exactly as she always had for the past 28 years. She had been my attorney since 1995, and during that time she had earned something far more valuable than my business. She had earned my confidence. There are lawyers who know the law, and there are lawyers who understand people well enough to recognize when the law will soon become necessary. Patricia belonged to the second group. "You sound troubled," she said before I had finished saying hello. I smiled despite myself. "Do I really? You only call this early when you've discovered something that doesn't make sense yet." That was precisely why I trusted her. She listened carefully as I described the subtle changes I had noticed since selling the company. I told her about Derek's increasingly frequent visits, the repeated conversations about property values, the carefully disguised questions about my estate planning, and the uncomfortable feeling that none of those conversations had happened by accident. Patricia never interrupted. She simply took notes, until I finished. The silence that followed lasted several seconds before she finally spoke. "Raymond," she said calmly, "do you believe your son-in-law has already done something illegal?" "No." "Do you believe he intends to?" I looked through my office window toward the backyard, where Beverly was watering the roses she had planted nearly 15 years earlier. "I don't know." Patricia nodded, as though she had expected exactly that answer. "Then you don't have a legal problem yet." I frowned slightly. "What do I have?" "An engineering problem." That answer caught me off guard. She continued before I could ask what she meant. "You spent your entire career inspecting structures before they collapsed. You never condemned a building because you suspected a crack existed. You inspected it. You documented it. You collected evidence until the facts could speak for themselves." She paused. "Treat your family the same way." Those words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. A week later, I was sitting across from Patricia in her Midtown office, reviewing every significant document Beverly and I had signed over the previous decade. She recommended revising our estate plan, not because anything was currently wrong, but because clarity prevents future arguments. Together, we transferred the Arbor Ridge property into a stronger trust structure, tightened every distribution clause, updated beneficiary instructions, and removed every vague sentence that could someday become someone else's opportunity. "Most inheritance disputes," Patricia explained while sliding another document toward me, "begin inside the spaces people leave undefined." By the end of the afternoon, every important decision had been documented with unmistakable precision. I believed we were finished. Patricia closed the final folder but didn't stand up. Instead, she folded her hands across the desk and studied me with the same thoughtful expression she used whenever she was deciding how much truth a client was ready to hear. "There's one more thing," she said. "I think you should install an audio recording system inside your home." I stared at her for several moments. "You mean surveillance?" "No," she answered immediately. "Documentation." She explained that Georgia law permitted one-party consent recordings under circumstances that applied to conversations inside my own residence when I was a participating homeowner. She wasn't suggesting hidden cameras or secret monitoring of private bedrooms, only discreet audio coverage in the common living areas where family conversations naturally occurred. "If Derek is exactly the man you've believed he is for 11 years, Patricia said, "the recordings will prove you worried for nothing. And if he isn't?" She met my eyes without hesitation. "Then you'll know before assumptions become lawsuits." 2 days later, a licensed security technician spent less than 3 hours installing several nearly invisible recording devices inside the living room, dining room, and kitchen. No bedrooms, no bathrooms, no guest spaces. Only the areas where every family gathering naturally unfolded. The system activated automatically whenever voices were detected and stored encrypted audio files that only I could access. The installer demonstrated how everything worked before leaving. I stood alone in the living room after he drove away, looking around the house. Beverly and I had spent more than 30 years building together. For the first time in my life, I hoped every recording would be completely boring. I wanted ordinary conversations, football games, birthday plans, and discussions about gardening. I wanted proof that my instincts had been wrong. But deep inside, another part of me, the engineer who had spent decades discovering hidden weaknesses before they became disasters, already suspected the truth would eventually begin speaking for itself. I simply didn't know how long I would have to wait before it did. For nearly 3 months, the recording system captured nothing that justified my suspicions. Every Sunday evening after Beverly had gone upstairs to read before bed, I sat alone in my study with a cup of coffee and headphones, reviewing hours of ordinary family conversations, football scores, vacation plans, Simone talking about work, Beverly laughing over stories from church. Derek sounded exactly as he always had, thoughtful, attentive, generous, and completely ordinary. More than once I caught myself wondering whether I had made a terrible mistake by allowing doubt to creep into a relationship that had taken more than a decade to build. I even considered calling Patricia to tell her we had overreacted. Then I remembered something I had learned during my first year as a structural engineer. The most dangerous defects are rarely visible during the first inspection. They reveal themselves only after enough pressure has been applied. So I kept listening. Week after week, nothing changed. Derek continued arriving with dessert, complimenting Beverly's cooking, helping clear the dinner table, and treating me with the same effortless respect that had made everyone admire him for years. If his kindness was an act, it was the most disciplined performance I had ever witnessed. Then came the 12th Sunday. It began like every other family dinner. Beverly prepared roast chicken, Simone brought homemade pie, and Derek spent half an hour discussing a commercial property he had recently sold. Nothing felt unusual. After dinner, Beverly went upstairs to call her sister, a tradition she had never missed in years. Simone stayed in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher, while Derek remained in the living room with me, discussing the Atlanta housing market. A minute later, Simone called his name and asked him to help dry the dishes. He walked into the kitchen, joked about breaking more plates than he washed, and everything still seemed perfectly normal. Then his phone rang. "Excuse me," he said with a smile, before stepping into the hallway between the kitchen and the living room. It was only a few feet away, but just far enough that he believed the conversation couldn't be overheard. He lowered his voice, instinctively. He had no idea the recording system didn't care how quietly he spoke. The call lasted just over 4 minutes. I reviewed it 3 times that same night, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Derek wasn't talking to a client about selling a house. He wasn't discussing financing or contracts. He was speaking with an estate litigation attorney named Curtis Breyer. At first, the conversation sounded technical, almost academic, as though he were asking general legal questions. Then he said my name. He mentioned the sale of Osei Engineering. He referred to our home on Arbor Ridge Drive. He asked how difficult it would be to challenge an estate plan if a large amount of family wealth had recently changed hands. Every answer the attorney gave seemed to encourage another increasingly specific question. Derek wasn't researching for curiosity. He was gathering a strategy. By the end of the conversation, there was no longer any doubt that my instincts had been correct. He wasn't interested in protecting my family. He was studying the fastest legal path to gaining control of what Beverly and I had spent our entire lives building. I removed my headphones and sat motionless in the darkness of my study for several minutes. Oddly enough, I wasn't angry. Anger clouds judgment, and I needed my judgment more than ever. What I felt instead was disappointment. Deep, quiet disappointment that someone I had welcomed into my family as a son had already begun treating us like a future legal opportunity. Early the next morning, I drove to Patricia's office with a copy of the recording. She listened without interrupting, then closed her notebook and looked directly at me. "Raymond," she said calmly, "this is no longer intuition, it's evidence." I nodded, but I wasn't satisfied. One recorded phone call proved Derek had begun planning. It didn't prove how far he intended to go. If I confronted him now, he would deny everything, blame curiosity, and become far more careful. I had spent 32 years learning that stopping an inspection too early often meant missing the real failure hidden deeper inside the structure. I looked across Patricia's desk and quietly said the words that surprised even me. "We keep listening." She didn't argue. She simply nodded once. Neither of us realized that the next piece of evidence wouldn't come from Derek at all. It would come from the one person he believed would never question him, my own daughter. 3 weeks passed after Derek's phone call with the estate attorney, and nothing on the recording suggested he had become suspicious. If anything, he appeared even more relaxed. He continued arriving at our house with the same easy smile, asking Beverly about her garden, discussing football with me, and treating Simone with the quiet affection that had always made me believe she had chosen the right husband. Had I not heard that 4-minute conversation myself, I might have questioned my own memory. It was remarkable how completely a person could separate the face they showed their family from the intentions they carried in private. Patricia encouraged me to remain patient. "People who believe they're ahead rarely stop moving forward," she told me. "Eventually they'll show you where they're going." She was right, but neither of us expected the next piece of evidence to arrive from inside Derek's own marriage. It came on a Thursday evening while Beverly was attending her monthly book club. I was in my study reading through an engineering journal, out of habit more than necessity, when my phone rang. The screen showed Simone's name. The moment I answered, I knew something was different. My daughter had never been a woman who wasted words, but that night she skipped every greeting. "Dad," she said quietly, "I need you to listen until I finish. Please don't interrupt." Her voice carried the controlled calm of someone trying very hard not to reach a conclusion too quickly. I set the journal aside and listened. 3 weeks earlier, she explained, Derek had come home unusually distracted after meeting a client. He wasn't angry, he wasn't upset. He was simply absent, answering questions with short sentences and disappearing into thought whenever he believed nobody was watching. Simone had been married to him for more than a decade. She knew the difference between a man carrying ordinary work stress and a man protecting something he wasn't ready to reveal. She hadn't confronted him. Instead, she had waited. "I thought I was imagining it," she admitted. "I kept telling myself everyone has difficult weeks." Then she described what had happened 2 days earlier. She had walked into their kitchen carrying a cup of coffee for Derek while he worked on his laptop at the table. The computer screen was angled toward the doorway before he noticed she had entered. She wasn't trying to read it. She simply couldn't avoid seeing the large property valuation displayed across the monitor. The address wasn't unfamiliar. It was ours. 4217 Arbor Ridge Drive, the home where Beverly and I had lived for more than 30 years. Simone said she froze for only a second before placing the coffee beside him and pretending she hadn't noticed anything. Derek immediately minimized the window, smiled, thanked her for the coffee, and continued talking about an entirely different subject. He never realized she had already seen enough. For nearly 48 hours, she wrestled with what to do. She told herself there might be a perfectly reasonable explanation. Perhaps he was comparing neighborhood values for work. Perhaps a client had asked about nearby sales. But no explanation ever answered the question she couldn't stop asking herself. Why our address? I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The timing matched everything Patricia and I had been documenting. The property valuation, the phone call, the repeated questions about the house. The pattern was no longer theoretical. It was becoming impossible to dismiss. I took a slow breath before speaking. "Simone," I said gently, "there's something I need to tell you too." For the next 20 minutes, I explained everything. I told her about Derek's sudden interest in our estate after the company sale. I told her about Patricia, the revised trust, the recording system, and the conversation with Curtis Breyer. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't tell her what to think about her husband. I simply gave her the facts exactly as I had collected them. When I finished, the line remained silent for several long seconds. Finally, she whispered the question I had been expecting since the day this investigation began. "How long have you known?" 14 months, I answered honestly. Another silence followed. Then came a sentence that broke my heart far more than anything Derek had done. "I wish you had been wrong." So did I, more than she could ever know. But wishing never changes evidence. After another long pause, Simone asked quietly, "What do you need me to do?" I looked through the study window toward the backyard, where Beverly's roses swayed gently in the evening breeze. "Nothing different," I replied. "Keep living your life exactly as you have. Let Derek believe neither of us knows anything. Don't accuse him. Don't warn him. Don't change your routine." "Until when?" she asked. My answer came without hesitation. "Until our 45th anniversary dinner." She didn't understand why that date mattered, but she trusted me enough not to argue. Neither of us realized that, by agreeing to remain silent a little longer, we had already set the stage for the 90 seconds that would change everything. From the day Simone learned the truth, nothing about our family routine appeared to change. That was the most important part of the plan. Derek continued coming to Sunday dinners, bringing expensive wine, complimenting Beverly's cooking, and laughing at stories he had already heard dozens of times. If he noticed anything different, he never showed it. He believed he was still the only person quietly planning for the future. Every week that passed made him a little more confident, and confidence has a way of making careful people careless. I stopped looking for dramatic mistakes because I had learned that the people who hide their intentions best are usually exposed by ordinary moments. I watched how Derek looked around the house when he thought nobody was paying attention. I noticed how often conversations drifted back toward retirement, investments, or the future of our property. He no longer asked direct questions because he assumed he already understood enough. Instead, he spoke as though certain decisions had already been made. One Sunday afternoon, while Beverly was showing Simone a new collection of flowers in the backyard, Derek stood beside me on the deck and quietly said, "A home like this deserves someone who knows how to protect its value." He smiled as if he were making casual conversation, but there was something different in his tone. He no longer sounded curious. He sounded confident. I simply smiled and agreed that every home deserved good stewardship. My answer gave him nothing, yet he walked away looking satisfied. Patricia later told me that silence often encourages ambitious people to create their own conclusions. Derek had mistaken my patience for ignorance, and every week that misunderstanding grew stronger. During the same period, Patricia completed the final review of every trust document, property transfer, and estate instruction. She called me one Friday afternoon and said, "Everything is locked exactly as we intended. Even if someone tried to challenge the structure tomorrow, there is no practical path through it." Hearing those words gave me peace, but it also confirmed something else. I was no longer waiting for legal protection. That work was finished. What remained was the truth. I wanted my family to see it with their own eyes instead of hearing my opinion about it. Simone understood that without another explanation. She never searched through Derek's belongings, never questioned him about the property, and never changed the way she treated him. She simply observed. Twice, she mentioned that Derek had become unusually interested in checking market values late at night after he thought she had gone to bed. Another time, she noticed him deleting browser history immediately after closing his laptop. None of those details proved anything by themselves, but together they matched the pattern Patricia and I had already documented. Then September arrived. Beverly became completely absorbed in planning our 45th anniversary dinner. She debated menu choices with the restaurant manager, argued playfully with me over which wine should be served, and spent nearly an hour deciding where every guest would sit. Watching her enjoy those preparations reminded me why I had refused to confront Derek months earlier. That evening belonged to her. It deserved laughter, memories, and gratitude before it became anything else. 3 weeks before the celebration, Beverly and I drove to Decatur to spend the afternoon with her sister. Derek knew we would be gone because Simone had mentioned it during Sunday dinner. What he didn't know was that the recording system had been reactivated after routine maintenance only 2 days earlier. Believing the house was empty, he used the emergency key Simone had given him years before and walked inside. Less than 2 minutes later, he answered a phone call in the living room. His voice carried none of the careful restraint I had heard months earlier. He discussed legal timelines, filing strategies, estimated settlement values, and even mentioned the amount of money he expected to control once my estate plan had been challenged. By the time the 6-minute conversation ended, there were no assumptions left to make. I listened to the recording 3 times that evening, then printed the transcript and placed it on top of every document I had collected during the previous 14 months. When I looked at the calendar beside my desk, only 26 days remained before our anniversary dinner. For the first time since Derek's behavior had begun to change, I realized the investigation was over. All that remained was allowing one confident man to stand up with a wine glass in his hand and believe, for just a few more seconds, that he had already won. The evening Beverly had dreamed about for nearly a year began exactly the way she deserved. The private dining room at Hargrove's glowed with warm light. Old friends filled every seat around the long table, and laughter drifted effortlessly between conversations about children, careers, vacations, and memories stretching back more than 4 decades. I watched Beverly smiling as she greeted each guest and realized that, despite everything Derek had done during the previous 14 months, he had failed to take away the one thing that mattered most. She was genuinely happy. For nearly 2 hours, I allowed myself to forget the recordings, the transcripts, and the folder waiting inside my study at home. I listened to stories from former colleagues, teased Simone about a childhood vacation she still insisted she remembered differently than I did, and even laughed at one of Derek's jokes. If anyone at that table had been asked whether something extraordinary was about to happen, every one of them would have answered no. That illusion lasted until Derek slowly rose from his chair with a wine glass in his hand. He thanked everyone for coming, praised Beverly for 45 years of marriage, complimented the family she had built, and spoke with the same polished confidence that had earned people's trust for more than a decade. Around the table, heads nodded, glasses were raised, and smiles widened. Then I saw it, the slight lift at the left corner of his mouth. The same private smirk I had first noticed 14 months earlier whenever he believed he understood something no one else did. I knew what was coming before he opened his mouth again. "I'd like to make one final toast," he said, looking directly at me, "to the old man who never knew what was happening under his own roof." A few uncertain laughs echoed across the room as guests searched each other's faces, wondering whether the remark was meant as harmless humor. I didn't answer him. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I reached into my jacket exactly as I had imagined doing hundreds of times during the previous month. My phone was already unlocked. The recording was already waiting. I pressed play. Derek's own voice filled the room before anyone understood what they were hearing. "Once the estate challenge is filed, the trust won't matter if we pressure them the right way. The house alone is worth more than enough." Every word came from the 6-minute conversation he believed had taken place inside an empty house. I played only 90 seconds. I didn't need the rest. By the time I stopped the recording, nobody was looking at me anymore. Every eye in the room was fixed on Derek. The confidence disappeared from his face so quickly that it almost looked painful. His fingers tightened around the stem of the wine glass until his knuckles turned white. Simone never looked away from him. There were no tears in her eyes, no anger, only the quiet expression of someone who had finally received confirmation of a truth she had spent months hoping wasn't real. Beverly remained perfectly still beside me, one hand resting gently on the tablecloth, her composure stronger than any speech I could have made. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Derek opened his mouth once, closed it again, then looked toward me as though searching for a mistake he could still correct. There wasn't one. I slipped my phone back into my jacket and spoke as calmly as if we were discussing the weather. "The old man knew exactly what was happening under his roof," I said. "I simply wanted to know how far you were willing to go before you believed you had already won." Nobody interrupted. Not one guest reached for a glass or whispered to the person beside them. The room had become something entirely different from the celebration it had been only moments earlier. It was no longer my word against Derek's. It was Derek's own voice, standing as the only witness anyone needed. I looked around the table at the friends who had shared our lives for decades, then back at the man who had mistaken patience for weakness. 14 months of quiet observation, careful planning, and disciplined restraint had led to this single moment. The investigation was over. Now came the part Derek had never prepared for, living with the truth after everyone else had heard it. No one spoke for several seconds after the recording ended. The silence was broken not by me, but by Derek. He forced an uneasy laugh, looked around the table, and said the recording had been taken out of context. He claimed he had been discussing a hypothetical legal scenario for a business client, and insisted everyone was jumping to conclusions. It might have worked if the room had only heard 90 seconds. Unfortunately for him, Patricia had spent 14 months making sure assumptions would never be necessary. Before Derek could continue, the private dining room door opened, and Patricia walked inside carrying a slim leather portfolio. Beverly had invited her weeks earlier under the simple description of an old family friend. Derek's expression changed the instant he recognized her. Patricia calmly greeted everyone, apologized for interrupting the celebration, then placed several sealed envelopes on the table. "Mr. Holt," she said politely, "before you explain the recording any further, I believe these belong to you." Derek stared at the documents without touching them. Patricia continued in the same calm voice. "One copy contains the transcript of the recording your father-in-law just played. The second contains the complete 6-minute conversation. The third contains certified records showing every revision made to Raymond and Beverly's estate over the last 14 months. The final document confirms that every asset you expected to challenge was transferred into an irrevocable structure months before your first consultation with Curtis Breyer. Around the table, several guests slowly exchanged glances. Derek's face had lost every trace of confidence. He finally picked up the first envelope, turned a few pages, then stopped when he saw his own words printed beside the exact timestamps from the recording. His shoulders dropped, almost imperceptibly. He understood that this was no longer an argument about memory or interpretation. It was documentation. Simone looked at her husband for a long moment before asking a single question. "Did you ever love my parents, or were they only part of your plan?" Derek opened his mouth, but couldn't answer immediately. Every explanation he considered would have contradicted something already sitting on the table in front of him. After several painful seconds, he quietly admitted that everything had started after Raymond sold his company. He said he had convinced himself the estate would eventually belong to Simone anyway, and believed he was simply protecting their future. Nobody accepted the explanation. Protecting a family's future doesn't begin with secret meetings, hidden recordings, and legal strategies discussed behind closed doors. Beverly finally spoke for the first time since the recording ended. Her voice remained steady, but the disappointment behind it was impossible to miss. "You never asked for our trust," she said. "You tried to build your future by planning around our deaths." Derek lowered his eyes. Even then, I felt no satisfaction watching him unravel. I had imagined this moment many times, yet revenge wasn't what I felt. Mostly I felt tired. 14 months of suspicion, preparation, and silence had ended exactly where I had hoped they never would, with my own family sitting across from one another as strangers. I looked at Derek and spoke as calmly as I had throughout the entire evening. "I never wanted to destroy your life," I said. "If you had chosen honesty at any point during the last year, none of this would have happened. Every consequence sitting in front of you tonight began with a decision you made when you believed nobody was listening." Derek slowly folded the papers back into the envelope without another word. The celebration was over. The marriage everyone had believed was stable only hours earlier had begun to collapse under the weight of its own deception. As the guests quietly prepared to leave, Patricia leaned toward me and whispered, "The legal work is finished." I nodded once before, looking across the nearly empty dining room. She was right about the legal work. But I knew the hardest part of this story would not be decided by documents, recordings, or court filings. It would be decided by whether a father and a daughter could still find a way to rebuild the family one man had spent 14 months quietly tearing apart. The anniversary dinner ended quietly. Guests left in small groups, speaking in hushed voices instead of the laughter that had filled the room only an hour earlier. No one asked me questions. They didn't need answers, because they had already heard the only evidence that mattered. Beverly slipped her hand into mine as we walked toward the parking lot, and for several minutes neither of us said a word. After 45 years together, silence between us had never been uncomfortable. This time it carried relief, sadness, and exhaustion all at once. We had protected everything we spent a lifetime building, but neither of us felt victorious. Winning against a stranger is satisfying. Winning against someone who once sat at your family table never is. The following morning, Simone arrived alone. The moment I opened the front door, I saw the overnight bag resting beside her suitcase. She didn't have to explain why she was there. Beverly embraced her without asking a single question, and for the first time since she was a little girl, Simone cried in her mother's arms. Between tears, she admitted that she had confronted Derek after leaving the restaurant. He had apologized repeatedly, insisted he had never intended to hurt anyone, and begged her to believe he could change. She listened to every word before asking him one simple question. If Dad had never made that recording, would you have stopped? Derek couldn't answer. That silence told her everything she needed to know. Trust isn't destroyed by one mistake. It's destroyed by the realization that the deception would have continued if it had never been discovered. Over the next several weeks, Simone began meeting regularly with a counselor, while Beverly stayed beside her through every difficult conversation. I never pressured my daughter to make decisions about her marriage because that choice belonged to her alone. My responsibility as a father wasn't to control her future. It was to make sure she had the truth before deciding it. Derek called me several times during those weeks. I answered only once. He apologized, accepted responsibility for what he had done, and asked whether there was any path toward earning my forgiveness. I told him Forgiveness and trust were two different things. I hope you become a better man, I said honestly. Not because it will change what happened here, but because the person you became over the last 14 months will eventually destroy every relationship you build. It was the last conversation we had. Patricia later confirmed that no legal challenge would ever be filed. After reviewing the estate documents and the recordings, even Curtis Breyer withdrew from representing Derek. The matter ended before reaching a courtroom because there was simply nothing left to contest. Every safeguard had been completed months before Derek believed he was preparing his first move. One quiet Sunday afternoon, about 2 months after our anniversary, Beverly and I sat on the back deck, watching autumn leaves drift across the yard. The same house that had become the center of so much conflict finally felt peaceful again. Beverly smiled and asked whether I regretted waiting 14 months before exposing the truth. I looked across the garden she had cared for since the day we moved into Arbor Ridge and slowly shook my head. No, I answered. If I had confronted him too early, people would have argued about opinions. By waiting, we never had to argue at all. Beverly squeezed my hand gently. Sometimes patience doesn't make justice arrive faster. It simply makes it impossible to deny when it finally does. 3 months after our anniversary dinner, life finally began to resemble the quiet rhythm Beverly and I had always loved. The house on Arbor Ridge was no longer a symbol of conflict. It was simply home again. The roses Beverly planted years earlier had entered another season. The porch, where we drank coffee every morning, felt peaceful once more. And for the first time in over a year, I no longer found myself wondering whether every conversation carried a hidden purpose. The investigation was over, the legal work was finished, and the recordings were locked away where I hoped they would never need to be heard again. Simone slowly rebuilt her life, one careful step at a time. She chose honesty over comfort, even though the decision cost her the future she once believed she had. Watching her regain her confidence reminded me that people are far stronger than they realize when the truth finally gives them solid ground to stand on. One afternoon, she joined Beverly and me on the back deck, looked around the yard where she had grown up, and smiled for the first time in months. I used to think this house was my inheritance, she said quietly. Now I know it never was. I asked her what she meant. She looked at both of us before answering. The inheritance was watching the two of you spend 45 years protecting each other, without ever sacrificing your principles. Beverly reached across the table and squeezed her hand. And in that moment I realized our greatest success had never been preserving property or protecting money. It had been showing our daughter that integrity is worth more than anything written inside an estate plan. Before she left that afternoon, Simone hugged both of us and promised that every important decision she made from then on would begin with honesty instead of assumption. After she drove away, Beverly rested her head against my shoulder and asked whether I would do everything the same way if I had the chance to start over. I thought about Derek, the recordings, the months of quiet preparation, and the painful anniversary dinner that had changed all of our lives. Then I answered the only way I could. Yes, I said softly, not because exposing the truth felt good, but because protecting the people you love sometimes requires patience instead of anger. Looking back now, I don't remember the recording as the moment that saved our family. I remember every quiet decision that came before it, the choice not to accuse without proof, the discipline to prepare instead of panic, and the determination to let facts speak louder than emotions. Those choices protected far more than our home. They protected our family's future. If this story leaves you with anything, I hope it's this. The strongest people are rarely the loudest. They are the ones who remain calm long enough for the truth to reveal itself. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what part stayed with you the most. Until next time, take care of the people who have earned your trust, because trust, once broken, is the one inheritance no amount of money can ever restore.